Actually, I had a pleasure of listening to Amy in one of the conference last year in Calgary. It was late last year, and she is amazing. So I'm just really looking forward to the discussion again. So welcome, Amy. Next, we have David Yiptung. Sorry, I'm not going in the order, but I'm talking with David. He brings with him a wide range of experience working in startups, large companies, and also not-for-profits in various industries such as manufacturing, energy, and telecommunication. In his current role as the regional director at Foresight Canada, technology development, commercialization and community engagement is at the heart of what David does. He has worked with hundreds of startups, technology startups and entrepreneurs, helping them build their business and connecting them with the resources and supports within the community. He also volunteers to coach student and entrepreneurs within the various programs in Calgary. So welcome, David. And then we have Edwin. Edwin is the manager of carbon policy for Enbridge, where he leads the company's climate policy. And one of his very exciting tasks, he said, was the development of greenhouse gas goals across Enbridge business units. He has also worked at Enbridge Gas Distribution and Equatest Solutions before working at Enbridge Inc., where he gained strong background in environmental management with focus on air emission, contaminated soil and groundwater remediation, and environmental assessment and screening. So I thank you, Edwin. So now, without any further ado, we'll start with the panel discussion. I'll start with Amy. So Amy, maintaining global competitiveness is crucial for industries. So in your view, what strategies do you think Canada can adopt to ensure its emission policies do not compromise the competitiveness of any key sectors while still meeting their net zero goal? And if I can add to that, are there any specific market mechanisms that Canada can leverage to address concerns around competitiveness?
Thank you, Pooja. Thank you for that question. Thank you for having me here today. Quite a lot to unpack, so let's break that down a little bit. First, is competitiveness important? Absolutely. Are there strategies Canada can deploy? Yes. Good policy. And are there market-based mechanisms? That's my favorite topic. Absolutely, and I'm going to talk a bit about international cooperation. So competitiveness is obviously important, and I think a message I really want to hit home is you cannot have environmental policy that doesn't consider economic impacts. They have to go hand in hand, and they have to be balanced if they're going to be effective. This does tie into the first real question, which is, what are the strategies Canada can deploy? And good policy, I think, would be the most effective strategy. There's examples of good policy and examples of bad policy that I will get into. So good policy would be ones that consider market-based mechanisms and emissions trading and using the different levers that we have available to make sure competitiveness is factored in. And those levers that we can talk about would be how thresholds are set, flexibility mechanisms, and performance incentives. So thresholds in the most basic terminology would be the amount of emissions that you're allowed to emit as part of your operations. The government will set a threshold recognizing that companies cannot operate without some emissions. Those thresholds need to be set so that emissions-intensive trade-exposed sectors aren't negatively impacted on the competitiveness side of things. So EITE is the acronym that you might hear, and it's for, again, emissions-intensive, trade-exposed sectors. So for example, a sector that does direct trade with the United States where there is no carbon pricing, that might have a higher threshold so that those companies would have a lower compliance obligation or a lower burden because of the environmental policy. Flexibility mechanisms are really important for competitiveness as well, and this I'm talking specifically about offsets, carbon credits. Not only can companies use those in lieu of buying fund credits or writing a check to the government, but they're traded at a lower cost than the carbon price, and so there's going to be efficiencies in meeting your compliance obligation if you're using carbon credits. I think the third lever is really important as well, which is performance incentives, and this does tie back into the comment around thresholds. Performance incentives in Alberta would look like emission performance credits. So if you come in under your threshold, or if you come in under your allowable emissions, you actually generate credits for every ton of CO2 equivalent that you're below what's allowed. And those EPCs, those tradable credits, could be applied against a different facility to again avoid paying the carbon price and buying a fund credit, or they could be traded to a different company and you're actually generating revenue for your good performance. I think Alberta does a pretty good job of this, and the tier system is actually the foundation. Well, the CCIR, the precursor to tier, was the foundation for the federal output-based pricing system, and so it's a very thoughtful piece of regulation. Alberta has a very robust offset system, one of the best in the world. We reference that internationally, and I think a very positive design element in Alberta's tier system is the use case, or the usage limit for carbon credits. By 2026, the Alberta government will allow up to 90% of your compliance obligation to be met with credits, which is one of the higher, it's the highest in the country, and I think that's really positive. I think that's really positive because carbon offsets are real, permanent, measured, verified emission reductions. Writing a check to the government is not an emission reduction. So if your goal of your environmental policy is to reduce emissions, we should be channeling as much finance as we can towards projects that are generating credits that have real emission reductions. So I think a 90% usage for offsets is fantastic. Counter that to Ontario, where their emission performance standard does not allow emissions trading. They don't allow offsets. Quebec allows 8%. BC will allow 30%. It's great to have some recognition, but again, emission reductions are the goal. We should be putting more finance towards those and allowing more use cases for carbon credits. So as you can tell, I'm answering the question around my notes, my comfort notes. As you can tell, I'm answering the question around competitiveness based on the assumption that Canada has carbon pricing systems in place, because I do think carbon pricing or compliance systems are one of the most effective ways of reducing emissions. It's proven to be so. So good policy is important to make sure that it stays functional. And examples, understanding that there's a large difference between good and bad, and it's always a grayscale, but policies that I would be more concerned about would be something like the oil and gas emissions cap. We don't think that this is efficient policy to overlay a sectoral specific cap and trade system on top of a well-functioning output-based pricing system. And I work at AIDA. We like a cap and trade system. We just don't think it makes sense to isolate a single sector when there are other high-emitting sectors in the country, and when every ton of CO2 has the same impact on the environment. It doesn't matter if it's coming from an oil and gas sector. So we think the oil and gas cap reduces confidence for investors, and it doesn't allow for effective market linkages. And market linkages would be intra-provincial or international emissions trading. But if a cap and trade system is not compatible with an output-based pricing system within the same province, we're not going to get those effective market linkages outside of Alberta. So the last question would be, what are some specific mechanisms that Canada could deploy? I want to talk about two. One would be CBAM. Would Canada consider a carbon border adjustment mechanism? You may have heard that Europe just put this in place, and the intention behind a CBAM is really to level the playing field by imposing a carbon price on imports if they're coming from a region that doesn't have an equivalent price on carbon. This would almost certainly target the United States, our closest trading partner, who notably doesn't have a federal price on carbon. And I know that it's not just as easy as saying, CBAM. There's a lot of political considerations, but I think that may be a mechanism Canada would want to explore for competitiveness. And also Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Not going to go into too much detail, but specifically when we're trying to look at how can Canada achieve net zero, international trading at the lowest cost possible is an effective tool. So a quick summary: competitiveness, wildly important. Policies need to balance environment and economy. Good policy design is one of the most effective tools that we have, and I think Canada should look at international cooperation to maintain, our leadership in carbon pricing.
Thank you, Amy. Before I forget, I was supposed to say that when the session started. We do have an artist here, Sam. She told me to tell everyone that she will be doing the graphic recording, and you can have a look at it at the end of the session, and a digital copy will be available for you as well. So, sorry, Pam, I forgot to say that the earlier.
Only quote the good parts, please.
Okay, so now we'll move on to the role of innovation and human capital. So, David, as you work with Foresight and you have worked with lots of technology startups, I'll take this question to you. So, how can organizations prioritize human capital to facilitate effective collaboration between industry professionals and innovators in the clean tech sector? And if I can add, how do you help industry professionals develop innovation literacy, enabling them to understand and support innovative solutions in emission reductions?
Yeah, thanks. This is a problem that is not just affecting sort of the climate sector, but also in Calgary locally. It affects the tech sector. And one of the signs of a very vibrant community or tech community is that you have people moving from one sector to another. So you can imagine I hate to use Toronto as the example, but when people are in Toronto, you can be working in the financial sector and be working in a different sector, whether it's medical devices or whatever, quite easily. You can move around. There's an understanding. We've had a dominant energy industry here, which has been great. And within the energy industry, it's very dynamic. A lot of people will move. We were just talking about people moving within the energy industry. There's a lot of movement within that industry, so it's very dynamic. So you get a lot of different perspectives. People understand cultures from different groups. Where it becomes difficult is when we start looking slightly outside of those realms, and that's where I think organizations could do a lot to really start looking, especially when you're looking at either acquiring talent or acquiring perspectives, to look at talent that comes from outside of your sector. And in the same way, I think that'll also help people better understand the energy sector. One of the challenges I know with everyone I know from out east, they don't understand the Canadian energy sector because they don't have contact with it. They don't have communication with it other than filling up their car. So having that sort of dynamic movement between people not only helps build the experience, but also helps bring the diversity of perspectives. So I think when I have to relook at your question because it's so long, when you look at developing human capital, if we want people to be well equipped to tackle these problems, these are huge systemic problems. These aren't very, very specific. We're not going to get, we don't need super specialists. We need people who are thinking on a systems level. So really having people that have experience in both, within the energy sector, but also from outside. So as an example, think about utilities versus oil and gas, right? Ag versus oil and gas, ag versus utilities, right? There's so many intersection points where if we had people with experience bridging those areas, we could actually have conversations and discussions about what solutions best suit those intersections, and that's really important. And I think that's where right now we're at a bit of a technological stalemate. Everyone's hoping for the moonshot because everyone is thinking within their own silo, and we're not looking at what's available just with our neighbors next door. So I think there's a lot to be said about how industry and how organizations really think outside their own sphere. I actually had the opportunity to be on a panel yesterday with an organization called Higher Landing, which is what helps people doing career transitions. And there was a gentleman there, oil and gas engineer, 30 years of experience, but he spoke like an oil and gas engineer. All the other people on the panel who were from Ontario didn't understand a thing he said. And it's like, okay, so part of the coaching was to teach him, okay, how do you speak less like an oil and gas engineer, but show the value you can deliver? Similarly, there was someone on the panel yesterday, someone in the session yesterday who had spent 30 years at TELUS, but he spoke like a telecom engineer, right? But he had huge amounts of value to bring, and he was thinking, oh, I could bring this value to AHS. But AHS is a completely different animal, right? Different language, different culture, but how do we create opportunities so that we share that knowledge and that experience? Some of the ways that industry professionals can develop their skills. Here in Calgary, there's an organization called Avatar that works with oil and gas companies that basically helps their engineers learn new design thinking methods, basically startup methodology. A shout out to Energy Futures Lab, who's in the room today, because they convene a wide cross-section of people from across the energy sector, but a wide cross-section of society, essentially, to basically talk about energy transition topics and include all the different voices in the room. So there are opportunities there. From what Foresight does, one of the things that we do is we run industry challenges. And what that is an organization will basically put up a challenge question saying, we'd like to solve X. And with that, we would source solutions globally from companies all around the world, and we put them in sort of a competitive format to see which challenge, which one rises to the top. A lot of industry organizations, a lot of companies will use a challenge format as what I would call innovation theater. It's a way of getting their own employees to see what's out there and to see the things that are happening and to see the things that are different. And I think the more, we're all very busy, and that's, I think, one of the challenges. Every industry has been squeezed for resources and time, so we're all just really focused on the return on investment we're providing. Having the opportunity to step back and actually see what's around and the things that are adjacent can really help build human capital. And I think Alberta's uniquely well positioned for that, because we do have our tech sector is actually unique in that it's quite diverse. We have health companies, we have oil and gas, we have energy companies, we have software companies, we have all kinds of, we're not like Silicon Valley where it's just software as a service. We're not Seattle where it's Boeing or Microsoft, right? We are actually quite diverse, and we need to use that to our advantage. And that means actually stepping outside of your comfort zone and actually starting to talk with people that don't speak our own language. I'll get off my soapbox now. That was...
No, that was great. Thank you. Thank you, David. Now let's move on to the policy landscape. So, Edwin, given the interconnected nature of energy infrastructure and policy landscape, how can organizations actively collaborate with government entities and stakeholders to influence and adapt to evolving policies? Carbon policies, to be specific. And can you give us any insights into successful collaboration and partnership?
No, thank you for the opportunity. Just to take a bit of a step back and kind of level set in terms of public policy, I just wanted to kind of reinforce the notion that public policy is really in place to help governments implement the priorities that they have. So public policy is essentially regulations and acts and legislation and whatnot to help them achieve the priorities that they have. So obviously that comes with a bit of political risk. And really, I see public policy in my years of experience at least as being either enabling, so incentivizing investments in new technologies such as carbon capture and storage, for example, or the production of clean hydrogen, but they can also be seen as regulating, so things like activities that the government doesn't necessarily want to have or wants to curtail, such as like the oil and gas cap that Amy was talking about, or the clean electricity regulation, for example. But from an industry perspective, I think one of the key criteria for a public policy to be effective is to provide regulatory certainty as well as transparency into how that particular piece of legislation is enacted. And that's really resultant from the fact that a lot of energy infrastructure requires significant amounts of capital and also is very long-term in terms of how long the particular project will last and how long it's in use for. So having that policy certainty and that regulatory sort of foundation that's dependent upon, that's something that energy infrastructure really needs. So if you're not familiar with Enbridge, we are an energy delivery company, and our mandate is to provide energy in a safe and reliable and sustainable manner. And within our within our climate policy, we have an aspect in there which speaks to the fact that it's important for us to collaborate on public policy, including things related to climate change with government and other entities, which is really supporting and based on the premise of the fact that we recognize that there's a growing demand for global energy, but then it also needs to be dovetailed with the notion or the fact that we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So that would include investing in things like conventional and also clean energy technology as well. So from the perspective of engagement, I think there's a number of pathways that are available for us to engage in public policy, whether it's direct submissions from a written perspective or direct advocacy with government, or also working through industry groups or different organizations like AIDA, for example, which Amy's part of, to help sort of reinforce and clarify what legislation should look like. So one of the most effective ways that we found, at least, for developing public policy in conjunction with government is working groups. So in the recently developed, British Columbia has their Clean BC roadmap for 2030, and I think a number of years ago there was also the federal government had workshops for their output-based pricing system. So as a natural gas transmission and distribution entity, we worked with the Canadian Gas Association to facilitate a workshop with the feds to show them some of the intricacies related to natural gas transmission and distribution, to help them understand what it looks like for us to manage and reduce methane in a way that's feasible, in a way that's cost effective, and in a way that's efficient. Oftentimes we make assumptions, I think, with regulators that they completely understand all the different sectors that we might be working from, but a lot of times that's not necessarily the case. And I think another example here is the amendments to the methane regulation. And speaking to the government, they're really interested in getting feedback from us to help them understand what makes the most sense for them when they're implementing their new regulations. I was also going to say, from an energy infrastructure perspective as well, it's really important to balance the government's intent to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with consumer affordability, as well as system reliability, and the ability for Canada, for example, to remain competitiveness in a global environment where everybody's competing for capital, right? So, for example, I could use the oil and gas cap, but I did talk about the clean electricity regulation here. So from our perspective, we definitely support the government's intent to reduce their emissions by 40 to 45% by 2030 and also achieve net zero by 2050. I think the challenge that we see around the clean electricity regulation, for example, is the pace and the scale that they're looking at actually implementing this. So again, it's important for us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but at the same time, looking at the potential investments that are required and impacts to consumer affordability, the reliability of the grid, as well as our ability to attract capital and whatnot, we see that as a bit of a challenge. So in working with other organizations, again, I think even working with AIDA and Canada Gas Association and a number of different organizations, doing direct engagement with the government to kind of explain this is what we see as being a potential challenge, but at the same time, we also want to identify the potential investment opportunities related to clean electricity and also things like carbon capture and storage. So really, we believe it's important for organizations to provide those policy options as well. And I think a good example here, and I'm glad you didn't talk about CCFDs because that was kind of one of my big speaking points here. But I really wanted to share a bit of an example here around carbon contracts for difference. So a number of organizations, particularly here in Alberta, are very interested in investing in carbon capture and storage. And if you're familiar with carbon capture and storage, it doesn't necessarily have a direct source of revenue attached to it. And one of the main sources of revenue associated with it would be the generation and sale of carbon offsets, environmental EPCs, like you were talking about as well. So again, Canada's 2030 emissions reduction plan relies heavily on carbon capture technology as a main source for, or one of the main sources for reducing emissions to achieve their objectives. But investments in carbon capture and storage, at least in the short and medium term, will require additional subsidization and whatnot to bring it to the scale, and to bring it to pace and scale that's able to reduce emissions at the the levels that we actually need it to be at. So the government has provided a bit of regulatory certainty, at least under the Liberal government that we currently have, in terms of the trajectory of carbon pricing. So we do have some certainty out to 2030, and we do have some, certainty around what the regulations look like. But in terms of making an investment, a company needs to be able to have certainty around the price that they're going to get for the carbon offsets that they sell, but also have some certainty around the supply and demand dynamics around the sale of those particular offsets. So to address this policy risk, I think Enbridge and a slew of other organizations, I know Cement, a number of different electricity organizations and whatnot as well, have approached the federal government and asked them for a carbon contract for difference. So basically what this does, it is establishes or sets a price that you're going to receive for your particular offsets, for example, over a certain time frame, so that when you're building out the economics for a project and you're looking to make a final investment decision, you have some certainty around the economics of your project. So again, working with different proponents, including AIDA, we advocated for a CCFD, and in December of 2023, the federal government announced that they would be implementing a carbon contract for difference through the Canada Growth Fund, which is a third-party organization, so you kind of minimize that or eliminate that stroke of the pen risk, which, if you're not familiar with, is basically if you have the Liberals in place now and we have a different administration come in, for example, they may eliminate some programs, for example. And then we see the same thing in the United States as well under the IRA and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. If a new administration comes in, you introduce a lot of the stroke of the pen risk as well. So some of the tax incentives and PTCs that we see under these maybe scaled back, for example. So the first CCFD was awarded to Calgary's Entropy, and basically what it does is it enables Entropy to reduce their investment risk to the point where they can make I think it's a $49 million investment in the second phase of their project. So under the Canada Growth Fund, they've committed to contributing $200 million to them over 15 years to purchase 185,000 tons of CO2e at a price of $86.50. So at this perspective, Entropy is now able to say, over the next 15 years, we have this predictable source of revenue, so we can go ahead and make a final investment decision to that particular project. And not right. Am I running out of time, or? No, okay. So from our perspective, Enbridge is developing a open access carbon hub in Wabamun, which is just west of Edmonton. So we have two different partners there. So we have Heidelberg Cement, and we also have Capital Power. And the project there would be looking at avoiding 4 million tons of CO2e with a phased-in implementation date beginning in mid-2025. So as part of the project, one of the major considerations there is obviously getting a predictable price and a predictable sale of the offsets that would be generated as part of this. So it's very encouraging for us. We don't have a CCFD yet, but certainly something that we're advocating for, and it'll be important at least for the first few projects. And to kind of build on that as well, one of the other things that we've been advocating for is Indigenous loan guarantee programs. So under this program, the federal government would be providing affordable and accessible sources of capital to Indigenous groups that want to invest in major infrastructure projects. So again, in Budget 2023, the federal government signaled that they were going to roll out this program. This program is already in place I think it's Alberta, Ontario, and BC as well. And as an example of the proactive support that we provided to Indigenous loan programs, as part part of our Wabamun Hub, we entered into an equity agreement with the First Nations Capital Investment Project, which is basically a group of 4 Treaty 6 First Nations, and I think there's a Métis group involved in there as well. And through the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program, they're able to acquire capital to be able to make an equity investment into the Wabamun Hub with us as well. And we see that as a model for a number of other programs and investments and projects that we're looking at in other jurisdictions like, Alberta and British Columbia and Saskatchewan as well. So just to kind of tie things up, really we see the role of government as being very critical in terms of stimulating investment into new technologies, and that really can't be understated. And public policy is really the lever that that government can use to kind of incentivize that sort of investment environment.
Thank you, Edwin. Yeah, kind of tied up pretty well into looking at government's role and working with them and on the different policies. I want to look at the future now. So I'll ask all of you, how can organizations support and promote innovations within the carbon markets? And also, are there any specific initiatives that encourage development and implementation of innovative solutions for carbon reductions and trading? As David works with lots of startups, I'm going to start with David here.
I think right off the bat, for innovators, one of the challenges they have is access to information. Like as an example, there's a graph. If any of you have subscribed to the newsletter Energy Minute, they have this great graphic on the number of carbon capture projects, as an example, that are slated to come online and the ones that are online. And it's basically, it's not even a hockey stick, it's a right angle, right? Because everything comes online in like 2025, 2030. The problem with that is that these are large-scale projects, and we won't have learnings from those projects until much later. And if you think about the pace that we need to be moving at, there needs to be a tighter feedback loop. And I think, in industry in general, whether it's utilities or whether it's energy, there are always safety concerns, there are always confidentiality concerns and things like that. But just like in healthcare as well, right, there's privacy concerns. But we can accelerate innovation if problems and learnings are fed back into the academic community, fed back into the innovation community faster. Because if we don't have that rate of information exchange, people don't know what problems to be solved, right? And then we're just waiting. We're just waiting for a large capital project to come online, and then 5 or 6 years later we realize, oh well, had we known that this is how it was going to turn out, we would have fixed these things. Figuring out how to get that dialogue happening, and Canada has tons of research institutions. We have a lot of innovation all across the country with different strengths. Like at Foresight, we publish these venture to value chains reports, and you can see sort of like, as an example, in carbon management, the number of different companies that are developing technologies across the country, but also what area of carbon management they're focusing on, whether it's direct air capture, whether it's the financial model, whether it is transport or utilization. And you can see that each region has a different strength. So unless we're getting that information back to the different regions and starting to have that, having those innovators work on actual problems and giving them an ability to test those solutions, we're not going to accelerate fast enough. So I think in terms of like what industry can do to encourage innovation, it might be just having to share information. And I know traditionally that is not something that is looked highly upon, especially when things go badly. And I think we were talking about this earlier. We need to be much more open to the idea of failure. That's something we talk about in the startup environment all the time. If you're not making a mistake, you're not learning. The problem is that when we're talking about things like this, people just want the answer and they want the solution right away. But we're going to have to like feel our way through this as we go along. There's tons of technology out there that has yet to be implemented, that is already there, it's been tested, but has yet to be implemented at scale. So we have catch up to do. I know the retrofit sector is fighting, the buildings retrofit sector is fighting that right now. They're going to be doing a lot of retrofits over the next couple of years, just with solutions that already exist. So in a similar way for carbon markets, how are we starting to push that and start to get some acceleration just in the level of activity in those areas?
Amy, would you like to add something?
I'm going to take it in a bit of a different direction, but I really appreciate what you're saying, David, about the need to share information. A very specific, very niche issue about getting more projects into the carbon market is the lack of methodologies or protocols. So for those nodding your head, probably working in carbon offsets, you understand that in order to generate credits, you have to follow the rules and requirements prescribed in what's called a methodology or a protocol. They're usually 60, 100-page documents, very technical, a roadmap for how you're going to quantify those emission reductions. They take a long time to write. They can be very expensive, and it's a really big barrier. So one thing that I'm exploring through my consulting company is how can we use AI to increase that process. Chad, we call him Chat GPT, we call him Chad. Can he help with writing these methodologies and getting them published faster? I really do see that as it doesn't get much airtime, but I see it as a really big barrier to getting carbon credits or getting projects able to generate carbon credits.
That's a good point. Edwin?
I think it's pretty much been covered. I was going to say, I think one of the key things in terms of that is really active participation within the market, I think, is one of the ways that you can demonstrate support for that market, and then communicating to regulators as well. Like, I think TIER is a great example. Demonstrating to regulators how important those carbon markets are and how important it is to have that regulatory certainty. I remember the last election we had here in Alberta when, it looked like the UCP was going to be coming in, and the NDP had put together the CCIR and whatnot. And then there was a lot of angst, I think, about what's going to happen to TIER, for example, or what is that regulation going to look like. And I know a lot of industry stepped up and said, no, we need to have that regulatory certainty moving forward, including the carbon market. So again, going back to TIER, that'll enable us to keep, investing in these new projects and these new technologies and whatnot. So I think it's really important for industry to kind of reinforce the fact that, yeah, that's important for us to have those markets. And you're right about the quantification protocol as well. Thinking about, I know you talked a little bit about Ontario and the environmental performance standard there and the fact that there's no credits. I know as a distribution utility there, we are making big investments in renewable natural gas, and we see the benefits of that from a climate perspective. But again, there's not necessarily that regulatory incentive to inject RNG into the natural gas stream. So working with the Ontario government there to say, either, build in some sort of accrediting system for RNG or hydrogen to kind of reflect the climate benefits of that to, incentivize investment, or some sort of other protocol, in terms of greenhouse gas quantification and whatnot. But again, I think it's just really important for stakeholders to communicate to regulators the importance, at least in the climate market or the compliance market.
And I'll double down on a point that you raised there. We need political support for market-based mechanisms. Period.
Yeah. There's something to be said as well. Like we're looking at highly regulated markets, right? Highly regulated industries, and when you think about how highly regulated industries foster innovation, you can look at the pharmaceuticals industry as an example, right? Pharmaceutical industries used to do a lot of primary research on their own, and then they realized they couldn't do it. As publicly traded companies, they couldn't justify the billions of dollars they were spending on the lab personnel, the lab facilities to do primary research. So they've all pulled out of that. But they funded universities now to do all that research, right? They've let them do all that exploratory research, and then they realize their role in the value chain is to take these, bring them to whatever phase 2 or phase 3 trial, ramp them up for manufacturing. Like, that's what they're good at. They're good at the scale part. But they admitted they were not good at the research part, or that they couldn't do it efficiently. And that's something to think about when we think about the regulated industries that we're in. Where can industry play with innovators and allow them the freedom, but also provide them the support they need when it comes time to build to scale, or to evaluate what scale means, and things like that, right? And I think that cooperation is really important. But like I said, you've seen that in the pharmaceutical industry where they basically pulled out of all primary research on their own, and they let the academic community handle that. And you've seen recently this, well, we went through a sequence where there was very quick approval on a therapy. That's something that comes out of that new way of thinking. Because you'll notice all the COVID vaccines, there's two companies involved. There's the big pharmaceutical, and then there's the small company that basically developed it. All the vaccine names have two names associated to them, and that's why they needed the partnership.
Thank you. I'll just follow up on that. So how can organizations assess the potential of these technologies in contributing to Canada's net zero objectives? I'll start with Edwin here.
Sure, thank you. That was an interesting question. I had to think about it a little bit. But going back to the carbon markets, I think carbon markets are probably one of the key enablers that there is for just assessing the potential of new technologies. And not to steal too much from Amy, but within the voluntary and compliance markets, I feel like they're a bit of a technology incubator, given the fact that I think as we develop these new quantification protocols and as we kind of, take a chance almost on them, there's an additionality concept that's built into those protocols as well. So at a certain point, a technology becomes mainstream, I guess, for lack of a better word. Common practice, and doesn't necessarily need the support of an offset to provide the additional economic input, for example. So I think successful technologies will fail to meet that additionality test over time, which demonstrates the fact that they're viable and they're commonplace, and I think they can be demonstrated to provide an effective approach for reducing emissions to help Canada achieve its net zero goals. So things like scaling up CCS, for example, or scaling up the production of clean hydrogen. These are all currently being driven through the offset market, I would say, and investment tax credits and other market mechanisms. So, yeah.
David, would you like to add to that?
It's more of a mindset. I think the way I looked at this question was everyone is looking for a technology that's going to be the moonshot, that's going to be the silver bullet, right? And if any of you have seen the movie Moneyball, right? It's not about home runs. It's not even about batting average. It's about getting on base. It's about being in the game in small steps and building that momentum. And in a lot of ways, I think that's where a lot of us, I think even as homeowners, were caught. One of my colleagues actually just sent a Slack message saying, "Oh, we need a new car. Do I pull the trigger on a hybrid or do I pull the trigger on an EV? Because it's a long-term investment for us, and we're going to be, we're going to have to deal with the pros and the cons." And I think a lot of us are caught in that thinking because we're always thinking about large infrastructure as opposed to thinking about the small things that can be done incrementally to get us moving and get us build the momentum in the right direction. As homeowners, we always think about the largest piece of infrastructure we own, which is our homes, and what do I do for that? And the amount of work it's going to take or the amount of money it's going to take. But there are other things that we can do, small things, and we all saw the small things that we could do when the emergency alert came out, right? We all shut off our lights, and what was it, 200 megawatts came off the grid within an hour? We're not talking enough about the small things that we can do and that we can actually have impact on, that are actually not that difficult for us to implement.
Amy?
I think Edwin and David answered that well. Nothing to add.
Okay, perfect. I hope you wrote down some questions for the panelists, so I'll open the floor for any questions. Well, my colleague Kelly will be bringing the mic, so.
Hey, thanks. I might throw a grenade when I ask this question, but
Not at me.
what are the panel's thoughts on the effectiveness of a carbon tax for reducing emissions? And a secondary question, are the additional industry regulations specific to industry diminishing or enhancing that effectiveness? So the oil and gas caps or the clean energy standards, fuel efficiency standards, the or the EV mandates, that kind of thing?
Who are you with? Who do you work with, for context?
Oh, I'm in the oil and gas industry. I work with a small oil and gas developer.
No, I appreciate that. It just helps frame it. I do think carbon taxes, or it's not quite the proper term, but carbon pricing is an effective way of reducing emissions. If you put a cost on something and you say you have to pay unless you reduce your emissions, when that price is high enough, and I know the oil and gas industry doesn't like this, but as that price increases, we do see genuine action to reduce your financial burden. And so that's, I think, driving this, race to CCS, because it's a large-scale way of reducing the price you have to pay to the government. I think you can counter this by looking at the voluntary carbon market, which is my focus of work. It's about a $2 billion market internationally versus about a $980 billion market for carbon pricing around the world. Right? The voluntary market is not what's driving investment. It's not what's driving the same scope and scale of emission reductions as we're seeing in compliance systems. I forget your second question, but hopefully that answered the first.
The effectiveness of additional regulations on top of the carbon tax.
I think that's where it gets complicated, and those are my remarks on the oil and gas cap. It's not effective policy to single out a single sector. Right? Our preferred approach at AIDA would have been to, if you really want to reduce emissions in the oil and gas industry, specifically the oil sands, well, let's modify the existing output-based pricing program to achieve the same end. Something like layering on a cap-and-trade system on top of an output-based pricing system doesn't allow fungibility of credits, risks double counting of the same emissions and the same emission reductions. I don't see that as effective policy. I think there can be effective policies layered on. Arguably, the CFR does regulate a separate component of emissions, looking at a fuel's carbon intensity. So it's sort of on a case-by-case basis. But there is a way to do policy right. If we're striking that balance, is a matter of opinion.
Hello, my name is Sabrina, and my question is with regards to the agricultural industry and what work is being done to partner with the Canadian farmers to help them access these carbon offsets to reduce their operating costs, ultimately translating down to the cost of food for just the everyday Canadian.
I can try. I'm an engineer, so I don't touch the ag space too much. But in the voluntary market, and Canada to an extent, we are seeing an increase in number of methodologies focused on agriculture. It's generally categorized as regenerative agriculture, so looking at things like cover crops, effective application of nitrogen, or effective application of fertilizer to reduce nitrogen emissions, right place, right time, right amount, right type, the 4 R's. Conservation, cropping, zero-till, now not additional anymore. There are some aspects of that, and actually at the federal level is, I would say, where we're seeing the most interest on that, because as the federal government is prioritizing methodologies, they're not writing methodologies for the oil and gas sector. They are looking more at nature-based solutions, including ag.
So I was just going to say, I think it's very similar to CCS in a sense, right? Because when you're investing in things like the regenerative cropping and you're investing in these additional fertilizers and things like Rutella and whatnot that increase the ability for roots to uptake nitrogen, for example, and reduce water consumption and all those kind of things, that costs money, right? But when you have a quantification protocol and you're able to generate credits to say that we're sequestering X amount of carbon in the ground because we're using these new techniques, that subsidizes your investment, right? And I think for the farmer, that enables them to generate more of a profit because, they're able to sell these credits and whatnot. So I think very similar to CCS, it's a big, large-scale investment up front, but enables, a whole bunch of other environmental benefits, right? And I think hopefully it flows down into the consumer as well to reduce food costs. But yeah, hopefully it reduces, use of fuel and everything else as well. So
I was just going to add that your question actually highlights the the comment I made earlier about the silos, right? Because carbon credits is really focused on industry, the energy sector, but there are a lot of there's a company working in Feedlot Alley north of Lethbridge that takes the waste from feedlots and turns them into renewable natural gas. There's a financial benefit to generating that RNG, but when you get into carbon pricing and credits and all that stuff, that's a whole other challenge for them, right? And I think there's not enough dialogue back and forth. There are groups that are working with the ag sector to try to sort of bring the benefits that they provide up to the that's a bad analogy, up to the surface a bit more, right? But yeah, that's one of the challenges I think is that it's just a sector they don't account in, right? It's not something they're used to dealing with. And I think that's a big issue. But Decentralized Energy Canada is doing a lot of work with, I know, rural landowners, especially in southern Alberta, who are basically building their own little microgrids and things like that. They're working with the City of Medicine Hat as well, which is Canada's largest microgrid, to sort of highlight what can be done in those areas. Again, sort of bridging that language barrier as well.
Hi, my name's Shane Harker. I have a waste and recycling company based out of Toronto, and we went through the process of understanding our carbon footprint 2 years ago and buying offsets for Scope 1, Scope 2. Now we're in the process of understanding Scope 3. Like, we're moving to electric vehicles, but if I drop waste off at a transfer, that's hauled down to Michigan. So we're understanding the entire scope of our waste. And the idea behind that is that we want to provide a carbon neutral service to our customers, so that the business is already offset. My challenge is, so I don't know if Bullfrog Power operates out here, but in Ontario, Bullfrog Power came out with this, I forget what the website is, but you can go on and buy your offset, just put your credit card in. And then I didn't like that one because it was landfill emissions, and so there's different types of credits. And then I forget which one we ended up buying, but now I got somebody contacted me on LinkedIn, and he's talking about offsets in blockchain, and I'm like, wow, this is turning into that Netflix thing that I watched and all of this fake. So as a person that just really wants to grow my business and do the right thing, how do I know my stuff is legit that I'm purchasing? Because even I was at Collision Conference in Toronto, and there was a startup that had a really good story about farms in India and regenerative agriculture and capitalizing on those offsets, but giving more to the farmers. So how do you weed through that and make sure you're actually having the impact that I want to?
Blockchain isn't the be-all, end-all. Doesn't make your credits any better. Be careful with the carbon neutrality claim. There's reputational risks associated with that. Make sure you're buying credits from a carbon crediting program that's endorsed by CORSIA, ICROA, or the ICVCM. And your best bet is going to be, that's a lot of acronyms, I know, and your best bet is going to be by purchasing credits through a broker or retailer. Some local ones would be A New Climate, BMO Radical, or Climeco. Straight to the point.
The person behind you.
I hope that's fair to say.
Hi, I have a question for Amy. So I work doing tier verification, and the majority of the clients that we do have, they're aggregates. We have some oil and gas companies as well, but we have some opted-ins that are, for example, a potato farm, cement factory, glass factory. How can, not we, but like we as a society, make tier more popular so we can have more opted-ins and in the future reduce emissions with them?
Great question, thank you. I'm going to explain what opting in means because it confused the heck out of me. Why would a facility or a company opt in to be regulated? And the reason comes down to, I forget who I said it to, but it's not quite a carbon tax. We have an industrial pricing program, a carbon levy. The carbon levy is consumer facing. We're paying 14.9 cents per liter at the pump, I'm not sure, right? And if you're not a regulated facility, you're also paying the carbon price through the fuel levy on all of the fuels that you're consuming. If you opt into the regulation, you don't pay the levy, you pay on your emissions. But as we talked about with that threshold, if you're paying on your emissions, there's an allowable amount of emissions that the government recognizes that you could, you're allowed to emit. So the reason that small facilities, even if it's a potato farm, we'll call it a facility, the reason that they would opt in is that they can take advantage of that threshold and not pay for every single ton of emissions, whereas they would be paying an equivalent price on the fuel consumed. So I would actually counter your point, now that I have that background, I would actually counter that point and argue our opt-in threshold is really low. I don't know if you heard, but Premier Kenney doesn't like the carbon tax. And so when he was axing the tax, he was getting rid of the levy. Didn't touch, well, he changed tier, but he got rid of the levy, which he was calling the carbon tax. So the federal carbon levy applied immediately. Nothing actually happened from that whole political stance. But what he did to allow people to avoid paying the carbon levy was allowing them to opt into the regulation. So in Alberta, you're automatically regulated if your facility emits more than 100,000 tons. You can opt in if you emit 2,000 tons. That's quite low. And so I think that arguably is a pretty decent policy to, again, put the price on your emissions while giving that flexibility so you're not paying for every single ton of emissions from the fuel consumed.
Maybe to build on that, so we're trading back and forth. Eventually, we actually have to start reducing. Mm-hmm. So is there a current, does our either provincial or federal government actually set a date for when those thresholds go down, and is the industry then moving to actually reduce as opposed to just trade with somewhere else the actual carbon we're emitting?
Do you want me to? I can. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So under tier, for example, there's a 2% tightening rate on an annual basis. So at the beginning of tier, I think it was a 10% reduction. So every organization or every facility has a emissions intensity, so tons per unit of production, for example. So in Alberta here, I think it's based on a 3-year average. So say your average is X tons per year, or your emissions threshold. So in the first year of tier, I think it was a 10% reduction that you had to achieve in year 1. And then every year after that, that threshold reduces by 2%. Mm-hmm. So over time, the absolute emissions will decrease. So you'll eventually reach, I don't know, whatever, your 40 to 45% reduction that Canada's looking for. So each province has to be able to demonstrate to the federal government that their particular program will help the feds achieve their final objective. So that's why we have these tightening rates. Like British Columbia, for example, is just developing theirs, and their tightening rate, I can't remember, it was really high. Yeah. I think anyway, long story short, yeah, there is, the trajectory is obviously to reduce emissions to a certain point, but I think what Amy was saying was about the trading piece is that it enables companies to achieve their compliance obligations at a, they obviously have to reduce a certain amount, but they can also reduce the amount that they're paying to achieve their compliance obligations by buying credits, for example. Which, I mean, if you think about greenhouse gas emissions as a global problem, as a global issue, as opposed to being sector specific, if you're reducing emissions by, procuring RNG or renewable natural gas, for example, you're still reducing overall emissions. It may not necessarily be from your facility, but on a broader basis, you are, obviously contributing to a reduction in emissions across the board.
I'm gonna add on to that quickly to sort of challenge that underlying assumption I heard there. The trading isn't a bad thing, because the tier regulation itself doesn't require emission reductions. Fundamentally, a company could continue to buy fund credits at 100% of their compliance obligation above whatever their threshold is. You can keep paying.
How do we get to net zero in 30 years if we're going now to 2% EU?
Maybe we need more policy. Maybe we don't want to overlap it. Maybe we need better policy.
I just want to say, we had Foresight had hosted a podcast at the end of November, and there was a researcher from the U of C. I don't want Sam to write this name down. under my name, but I think it was David Keith. But he mentioned something really interesting, which is like if we hit our targets, if you think about what all the countries around the world have signed up for, that just limits the increase in temperature of the world. It doesn't stop it. It doesn't account for the increase in temperature that we've already incurred. So he was making the point that if you think about all the sort of climate issues that we're experiencing now, hitting our net zero target doesn't actually abate or reduce the changes we're already experiencing. This means that we have to start figuring out how to go in reverse. And that was his response to the criticism that people had around direct air capture and things like ocean alkalinity and things like that, other ways of capturing carbon. Because people are like, why are you bothering taking carbon out of the air? Like, why bother? And that was his point, was that even if we hit these targets, the temperature of the Earth is still increasing, and everything that we're experiencing is still moving ahead. It's still getting worse. So like that's a whole, it's a bit doom and gloom, but it's also a bit of a way of changing our thought process around these are goals that we've set just to get ourselves in line, but we have a larger objective after that, right?
I'd love to continue the discussion, but we are unfortunately out of time. We are on a tight schedule, so I'm going to stop here. So thank you so much for participating, and thank you so much for attending the session. We do have a lineup of really amazing sessions. So please look at the QR code and look at the next session, which will be starting at 11:15. So thank you again for attending the session.